Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's panel webinar on advancing the use of blue carbon for coastal systems. Today's webinar is part of our monthly Collaborative Science for Estuaries series, which features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the Science Collaborative. Before we get started today, we'll give a bit of background on the reserve system and the premise of the webinar series. All of our panelists today either work for or have partnered with one of the several of the reserves in the system, so it might help to start with a quick primer on the reserve system. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The NERRS Science Collaborative hosts this webinar series and is one of the research funding mechanisms for the reserve system. In addition to providing grants, we also work to promote the great research and engagement happening across the reserve system through our Collaborative Science for Estuaries series. Due to the large audience we have with us today, all attendees were muted upon entry, and we will be handling questions via the question feature on the GoToWebinar console. Questions will be saved for the Q&A portion at the end. However, we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar. You can send questions by entering them into the questions field in the console. This webinar is about sharing the blue carbon work the Science Collaborative has supported over the last decade or so. You can see on this map that the work has been diverse in terms of region and how teams are working to address research and coastal management needs. Our panelists today are representatives from some of these project teams. The discussion will center around lessons learned from their work and next steps, needs, and opportunities for moving blue carbon forward. Following the discussion, we'll have time for a Q&A session. Attendees can type their questions into the chat box, as I mentioned, and the team will verbalize them to panelists. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's session. Today's panel will be moderated by Stephanie Simpson, who has extensive experience working on blue carbon and has contributed to a number of projects in the reserve system. Steph is the Coastal Wetland Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy's global teams. In this capacity, she supports CNC's regional programs to develop climate finance market mechanisms and support coastal wetland restoration and conservation project development. I'll let Stephanie provide a little more background on herself and then introduce our panelists. Steph, thanks for being here with us today. I'll hand it over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nick, so much. As Nick said, my name is Steph Simpson. I've been working on blue carbon for the past 6 or 7 years now, doing a lot of that work first at Restore America's Estuaries and now at the Nature Conservancy. And I happened to begin my career many years ago with the Ace Basin Reserve in South Carolina. So I've been working with the reserves for a long time. They're just a great system. The NERRS Science Collaborative has been a great leader in funding a lot of this blue carbon work and pushing the envelope forward. So I'm really excited to be here today and to work with our panelists today to kind of share some of the lessons that we have learned through the various blue carbon projects that the Science Collaborative has funded. So first, I think we'd all like to learn a little bit more about you, our participants. So we've got a couple of polls coming online. The first you'll see right here is asking you what kind of organization that you work for. So I'll give you a few moments to enter in that answer there on the screen. You can just click in the little box there. And while you're filling that in, I hope that this is finding everyone nice and healthy, maybe somewhat physically isolated, but we really appreciate you all still participating on today's webinar. It looks like we have a lot of people representing government agencies, quite a number from nonprofit organizations, a fair number from university and colleges as well, and some smaller representation, but still there from our for-profit organizations. Thanks so much for answering that question. We have another poll question that should be coming online. And that next one is telling us a little bit more about where you work and what regional part of the US you work, or there's also an up there if you're coming at us from outside the US right now. So if you could all, again, enter in the answer that most closely describes where you are joining us from or from where you work. And as those answers come in, we see a lot from the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic or Great Lakes, as well as the West Coast, Pacific or Alaska. The next is Gulf of Mexico. That's where I've done some of my blue carbon work. That's awesome. A few from the Southeast, and other I'm going to assume is from the outside the US. So thank you all for logging on to participate live with us today. And we have one final polling question, and that is to give us, your moderator and panelists, a little bit more idea of what your experience level is with blue carbon. So whether this is a very new concept to you, something you've heard about but you haven't really necessarily worked on the topic, or maybe you've worked on a blue carbon project, research, pilot project, or inserting blue carbon into policy frameworks, management frameworks. Let us know by selecting one of the choices. And I'll add that this webinar is for all levels of experience with this topic. While we won't be going into too much background, I think some of you were supplied with some of that background. So we're going to talk a lot about the lessons learned from those different projects that we've all worked on. So it looks like more than half, a lot of people have responded that they've heard of blue carbon, but haven't worked on the topic. That is great. For those new to blue carbon, that's perfectly fine too. We hope you'll learn a lot. And for those who are working on blue carbon projects, thank you also for joining us today. We are going to have a question and answer aspect at the end of our, towards the end of this webinar hour. So if you have questions, whether you're new to the topic or been working on this for a while, please be inserting that into the question or chat box. So next, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. I'm very happy to be working with everyone here. So I've actually worked with a number of our panelists. I'm excited to introduce them to you. So we'll go ahead and go from left to right on my screen. So starting with Craig Cornu from the Institute for Applied Ecology, and Craig is out in the Pacific Northwest. Hi, Craig.
Hi, Steph. Hi, everybody. I'm Craig Cornu. I worked at the South Slee Reserve actually for a bunch of years. Started back in 1995, and just about 5 years ago, I sort of retired. And as Steph mentioned, I've been affiliated with the Institute for Applied Ecology, which is based in Corvallis, Oregon, but I still live in Coos Bay. And now I mainly am the coordinator of the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, and I manage the working group projects as well as some other projects, but glad to be here.
Great, glad to have you, Craig. Next up, welcoming Tana Marie Surgeon-Rogers, who is coming at us from Massachusetts Cape Cod area, working at the Wacoit Bay Reserve. Hey, Tana, how are you?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be with you today. And as Steph said, I work at the Wacoit Bay Research Reserve in Massachusetts. I am the manager here and also the Coastal Training Program Coordinator. My work in blue carbon started about just over 9 years ago when we began a project called Bringing Wetlands to Market, working with a diverse team of scientists, conservation organizations, different stakeholders working in state and local government, community members, and educators. And that project occurred over 2 phases. And during that time, the Bringing Wetlands to Market team had the pleasure of also doing several transfer projects, sharing knowledge, understanding, and tools that were developed under the project with many of our partners in the reserve system across the country and with other partners. So I'm very excited to share, represent our Bringing Wetlands to Market team and share some of our lessons and what we have been up to over almost a decade.
Great, thanks, Tana. And last but certainly not least, I'll introduce Kui Walker, who's coming at us all the way from Alaska's Ketchikan Bay Reserve. Hi, Kui.
Hi, thanks. I am also really excited to be able to join this webinar. As Steph said, I'm here in Alaska. Our peatlands, our wetlands are all under snow right now, but I'm the manager of the Ketchikan Bay Research Reserve. I'm also a watershed ecologist. Our perspective on blue carbon, we're relatively new to it here. We come at it from a perspective of learning that the vast peatlands in our region are really important for salmon, and those peatlands are also under threats from development. We have very low regulatory environment here, and so our perspective on blue carbon is to find ways to conserve those peatlands for the benefit of salmon and also for climate mitigation. And so we have done some initial assessments. We're working on those still now. Tana Marie and Wacoit Bay helped us a few years ago kind of build out our understanding of what it takes to bring wetlands to market. So that's where we're at. We're in the trying to develop projects that can conserve wetlands to protect salmon.
Great, thanks so much, Kui. And thanks to all of our panelists for being here today. I'm glad that we could keep this going and share our lessons learned with our audience today. I'm here as your moderator, but I've also led a NERRS Science Collaborative Blue Carbon project in the Gulf to help expand blue carbon knowledge and grow a network. So I'm happy to share some lessons learned as well throughout our discussions today. So with that, I'd love to just go ahead and get us right into our discussions with our first question. So the first one I'll offer to our panelists here is, what are the 1 or 2 most important lessons you have learned through your work that you would want to share with those working on blue carbon, interested in exploring blue carbon in their region, or just to become more familiar with the topic? And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pick on Craig right there.
Great, thanks, Steph. So I was thinking about this, and since my background at South Slough has been so immersed in habitat restoration, tidal wetland restoration in particular, I come to this with that filter. I'm always thinking about the restoration aspect. And it sounds like a bunch of our participants may know this already, but I thought it'd be worth noting that in the early days when we were hearing about blue carbon, some of us were under the impression that blue carbon was going to pay for all of our tidal wetland restoration projects. And so the first lesson learned, which most of you probably know, but it's important to underscore here, is that unless and until carbon prices drive market prices rise dramatically, carbon financing is going to be part of overall restoration project funding. It's not going to be the strategy itself. So it was good to learn that right away back in the day. Also, actually, I have 3 things to share here. The second thing is scale turns out to be an issue for developing financially viable projects. And because of that, that creates potentially positive incentives, in my opinion, for restoration planners. Again, at current carbon market prices, these blue carbon projects really do have to be pretty big, or you have to combine multiple projects aggregated into one project for the concept to work. And because of this, I think a carbon financing approach has the potential to create an incentive for more landscape scale restoration planning, which may be common in some of your areas, but it's certainly less common here. And I can see that having a positive influence on how we approach in our individual estuaries here in Oregon, how we approach restoration. Finally, speaking of incentives, it turns out that our most recent project really underscored the fact that the most viable carbon finance projects out here in the Northwest are going to be those that restore forested tidal wetlands. And you may or may not know, but we have lost over 95% of that habitat type out here on the West Coast. And those habitats used to be used extensively by juvenile salmon. So they're really, really important. So anyway, carbon financing could help heighten the priority out here for restoring forested tidal wetlands in the Northwest. It's already a priority, but it really helps to have another element pushing us in that direction.
Yes, thanks, Craig. Yeah, for certain, it's another tool in our toolbox, so to speak, to really bring attention towards these habitats. So thanks so much. Tana, I'll go to you next for this question. Those 1 or 2 lessons learned, or in Craig's case 3, but it's okay.
Thanks, Steph.
Sorry.
I'll start with one, just looking at the journey that we went through with the Bringing Wetlands to Market project and the team. And I recall that when we started our project, and this was in 2010, assembling our team, and looking back now, at that time, just not many people were focusing on the ecosystems of blue carbon. And so my role on the project initially was to really work on connecting the science with different end users and stakeholders who could apply it in different realms. And at first, that project, that effort was challenging because you're talking about a new concept and really needing to build awareness, and also then to talk about application, and as the science was being explored. And so, but I look back now and I see the amazing amount of learning that has happened, all these innovative tools and approaches that have come out and partnerships that have been developed. And so the lesson from this that I wanted to emphasize is that blue carbon can really be capitalized on in a number of different ways. And it has relevance for use looking at climate change policies, climate action plans, greenhouse gas inventories, looking at coastal resilience and adaptation planning, looking at restoration and habitat restoration issues, conservation practices, and looking at building community appreciation and value for our coastal wetlands, which is not something to be taken lightly, as well as looking at its value for just science education in the classroom. And when I look at the breadth of all of that and where blue carbon can be tied in, it is an amazing body of learning, still a lot to be discovered and a lot to be applied. But the lesson is that we've come a long way in these 10 years, and there's a lot of threads that people can apply depending on where their work takes them. And so I just thought that would be an encouragement to say, even if you're new to the topic or you're starting and working in one realm, it has so many different application points in these various areas that I mentioned. Secondly, one of the things that our project kind of unearthed and brought a lot more attention around was a new angle looking at the value that can be gained from methane reductions by restoring flow to tidal restricted, freshened, impounded wetlands. And we have a lot of those in New England. I'm sure there are many of them also in other places, other regions over the country. And while we don't have big, wide sprawling wetlands in terms of scale compared to some other regions, we have a lot of wetlands that are iconic to the New England landscape, and many of them have tidal restrictions. And here we have an opportunity by restoring these systems to be able to function the way they were designed. We're also able to reduce methane reductions, and by so doing, we're offering a greenhouse gas benefit. And so right in our backyard, we have the potential to make a blue carbon difference and have a climate mitigation benefit. And so I thought that was also a very encouraging kind of lesson to be learned and an opportunity that's right in front of us. And I'm going to stop there so I can give my colleague, Kuli, a chance to chime in.
Yes, thanks so much, Tama. I was actually just thinking the same thing, that blue carbon has been an amazing way to help drive forward research in a lot of these areas, and while also showcasing how we can address climate change in our communities. So very well put. And so Kui, yes, I'll go to you next. What's 1 to 2 lessons learned that you'd like to share?
I'll build on both what Craig and Tana Marie and you, Steph, just pointed out. So in Alaska, as I mentioned, we have these really vast peatlands that are underappreciated, I would say. People don't really realize the connection that they have to supporting a lot of animals and plants that we depend on, including salmon, which are for us a really iconic and important species. And so we've done a lot of research understanding how these peatlands are important, regulating thermal temperatures in streams, as well as providing nutrients to the streams. But making that research relevant to people in a way that they could do something was a gap that we had, and blue carbon represented an opportunity to really capture people that might otherwise not have been interested or been able to access this information. And so that kind of speaks to what Tana Marie was just saying, we've been able to reach out to a lot of partners, particularly landowners. And this gets to what Craig was saying. One of the things that's so exciting about blue carbon to us is that we have these huge peatlands. We have large landowners, our borough, our native Alaskan corporations, other states, our state owns a lot of them. And by being able to bring these people together to understand how we can protect peatlands and get some financial benefit, all for the benefit of wild Alaskan salmon, has been really exciting and really invigorating. And the scale is huge here. And so the opportunity to actually make it a financially viable thing is also, we think anyway, realistic. So there's just a lot of opportunities to bring people together to understand these peatlands that we have and to think about ways that we can work together to conserve them. So it's all been, yeah, really exciting so far.
Great, thanks, Kui. Yes, I have to completely agree. I mean, that's amazing when we do all these different workshops and outreach on blue carbon, is that we're really reaching new audiences, and the response we get is always very encouraging and exciting about being able to push this work forward and find new partners to do it. So that it's very encouraging. I'd love to go on to our next question for our panelists then. Thank you all. So the next question is, what do you see as the next steps, opportunities, and needs for moving blue carbon work forward, for getting it into more of a common practice? And maybe that's research needs, communication needs, partner needs, other resources or data needs. I'd love to hear from you, and I'm going to switch it up a little bit and call on Tana first.
Okay. All right. So I'll start with one need. I mentioned that would connect to one of the lessons that I talked about. I mentioned the fact that we explore this angle of methane benefits from habitat restoration. And one of the areas of research need would be to better understand methane fluxes in different wetlands types. This is going to be very important also when it comes to the market angle of bringing wetlands to market. It would also have application there, as well as in when we're talking about developing restoration plans, looking at what habitat change, what will happen in different areas in the wetlands, and also just understanding greenhouse gas benefits overall. So that's one area where the science that our project has led us to is another emerging topic that needs kind of further understanding around. Another need or opportunity, I think, would also connect it to what I mentioned before, is that I think an amazing body of knowledge has been garnered both from the science innovations that have taken place and just building our understanding of greenhouse gas budgets and dynamics and environmental factors that affect them in different wetland systems, but also being able to capitalize on that even more than we have. Right here in Massachusetts, we're looking at really making the connection even more, even in a more direct way, to looking at the role of wetlands and other vegetated areas in greenhouse gas policies and inventories, and really working with policymakers to unpack that even more and think about real policies that can be put in place to maximize this learning and put it into action in a real world sense. And so I think on the market side too, there is an opportunity here to really work with community members to see the market piece as an opportunity, as something to be explored, but not a be-all, end-all. That it's really about ecosystem services, protecting those in wetlands, protecting the whole wetland, and thinking about restoration value, conservation value, and then this market piece as being additional and bonus for investment in restoration. So with those three areas of both looking at greenhouse gas policies and where blue carbon applies, furthering research on methane dynamics in different wetland systems, and then harnessing the body of work already done for different stakeholder groups, I think is where we can take this work into the future.
Thanks, Tana. I completely agree. We talk a lot about the research needs and the market needs, but there is this great opportunity to integrate that work within policy frameworks. And we've already seen with the U.S. National Greenhouse Gas Inventory that actually coastal wetlands have been included within that national accounting system. The U.S. is one of the first countries to do so. But there's also an opportunity for states to do that for their own state reporting, state inventories as well, as another way to highlight these systems for their climate mitigation benefits. So that's a really great point. I'll go ahead and I'll go to Kui next. Those additional next steps, opportunities, and needs for moving blue carbon forward.
So for the place that we're at, what we really are trying to do is to develop a demonstration project, because that's what we hear back from all of the excited, interested parties, is that this all sounds really interesting, but I need to know, I need it to be at a place where I can understand what the benefit to us as landowners is. And so that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to assess volumes of peatland in these, and so that we can extrapolate that out and then assess develop the methodology for understanding, the emissions from those peatlands, and being able to understand how to bring them to market. And so that's what the people in our region really want to see. We're bringing together the biggest landowners, as I mentioned earlier, that can then do a demonstration project on a really big scale. And then that would be able, other individual private landowners would be able to opt in to that project if it turns out to be feasible. The other thing I just want to point out, which is a little bit, makes you smile, but I think it's really legitimate in that, and Tana Marie brought this up with restoring tidal flow to wetlands. One thing that we know is happening here is with climate change is that our peatlands are drying. And I think that we're going to have to be a lot more proactive about how we approach climate mitigation. So these peatlands have the potential to be great stores of peatland and have that peatland, have that carbon be on the market, but we also have to really make sure we keep them more inundated. And so this gives us an opportunity to do more research on beavers, which have been trapped out of a lot of regions here. And I think this is a topic that gets people pretty excited, including myself, of restoring beavers, restoring inundation patterns to keep carbon in the peatlands.
Thanks, Kui. And I love that you just made a connection from blue carbon to peatlands to beavers. That's amazing. And I think that's indicative of a lot of this work. We're able to make those cross connections and really look at these projects, at these systems in that landscape view. And you definitely hit on, something that I know is a big need, and that is those proof of concept demonstration sites. We have a lot of work that's gone into research and developing those market tools, those methodologies. So now is it's a really important time to be able to show that proof of concept where we can as well. So Craig, we'll come to you next with that question of what do you see as those next steps, opportunities, and needs for moving blue carbon forward?
Well, for us out here, it's virtually the same. I'm going to jump on the demonstration or pilot project bandwagon. We are marching towards that goal to try to establish the viability of using carbon finance to support tidal wetland restoration projects out here. I'm told by the folks that I work with that there's already keen interest among carbon offset buyers in making investments in wetland projects. So the money is apparently there, or it was there until last week, but it hopefully will be there again. We just need to prove the viability of these wetland projects in a carbon finance scenario. And also, and that's on the voluntary market side, my understanding is that on the regulatory or compliance market side, wetland projects just aren't an option yet. They're not accepted yet. So they need to see that these projects can work, and so they work for people who want to buy those carbon offsets. I'll also reiterate something that Tana Marie said. We also are marching towards filling methane emissions data gaps out here, especially in degraded and restored tidal wetlands. So that's that's some research that our working group is working towards finding funding right now. And that's it.
Great, thank you, Craig. I think that was a great point that I think all of you Med was talking about, the methane reductions. That's a huge opportunity. For a teeny bit of background for people who are less familiar with this, we've through research that's been led by the Bringing Wetlands to Market team, so Tana's project that she's mentioned, we found that freshwater wetlands tend to emit a lot of methane. And so if you can restore tidal flow to tidally restricted areas, think of that wetland that's being broken across by a bridge or something like that. If we can restore hydrology and restore the salinity, then methane basically becomes a non-issue. You're reducing all those methane emissions. And we know that methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, and carbon offsets are measured in terms of CO2 equivalents. So you could imagine projects like the ones that Craig and Tana and we have all talked about that reduce methane emissions would actually generate a lot of carbon dioxide equivalents or carbon offsets. So that's a huge area with a lot of potential that we need obviously further research on. And I do want to speak real quickly to the pilot project, because that was also brought up by all three of you, I believe, the need for this proof of concept. And that's something that I have in my current portfolio at TNC that we're working on right now. We have a project out in Virginia on the Eastern Shore that's been restoring eelgrass, and we're working to bring that project to market. We're looking at a number of other areas as well. I think this is a really important part of this. As Craig said, there's interest. There's a lot of interest. I get contacted by firms and third-party providers looking for blue carbon credits. So we know that there is this demand out there, and we really want to be able to hit while the iron's hot, so to speak, and get these projects to market soon so that we can satisfy some of that demand and keep people interested in these credits and in supporting these systems. So thank you so much, panelists, for answering those questions. I think, Tana, did you want to add to that?
If I may, Steph, I would like to just speak to one more need and opportunity that I see, if that's okay. And it's on the communication side about blue carbon, because I think all of us on the panel have had the opportunity of working on projects, and Chloe mentioned that they're newer to the blue carbon conversation, but have certainly learned a lot already. And all of projects represent a journey in understanding. But I think that we've gotten better at talking about this ecosystem service and ways to make that connection and make it relevant to different audiences. I think there are even more skill sets that can be brought to the table to really harness what we have learned in different places and unpack that and make it exciting in terms of graphics, or make the connection, because it is a complex topic. It is a complex topic when you get into different aspects of it. And I didn't want to forget that communication aspect, and to say different stakeholders in different spheres of where you're applying that might need information packaged and presented in slightly different ways to make that connection. And so I think that our teams are already working on that and have already made a lot of progress. But there is that continuing need to look at different ways to get that, I won't say a message, but this whole packaged area of understanding broken down, explained, further applied. And it calls on getting communication specialists involved to really help us bring that story out to the community at large. And we're always looking to make connection and to make a topic relevant. So I just wanted to pop that need in there as well. Sorry to take some time.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much for making that point, because you're right, that is a huge opportunity for us to take what we're learning and be able to communicate it. And as you mentioned, these are complex topics, coastal wetlands, climate change, and so being able to frame that message in the right way to the right people is so important. I mean, I often think about what we do in the restoration community. We were all about making those people connections and helping people care about these systems, and that has everything to do with how we communicate about their importance. And the reserve system has great resources for a lot of these projects. I'm sure the website or resource can be shared afterwards, but there's fact sheets, there's videos, there's web resources, as projects that like Kubi and Tana and Craig are working on, and myself, as we develop these projects, we are making communication resources. So I hope that can be useful to people who are interested in moving forward with some of these projects as well on their own. Any other, before we move on to some questions, any points our panelists want to make? Great. Okay. So with that, I would love to open it up to some questions. So Nick, Lynn, if you have any questions that have already been interested, if you're listening in and you have a question, please enter that into the webinar panel box. We're going to get to as many as we can in the next, say, 20 minutes or so. Nick, do you have one queued up for us?
There are quite a few queued up for you, and I think Megan and Lynn are going to take turns asking them, so I'll pass it over to them.
All right.
Yes, I've got one here. Sure. Question is, does preserving carbon that would otherwise soon be lost, for example, due to wetland loss, count for sequestration in any carbon market?
Great question. I might take that one actually, guys, real quick. So yes, so carbon that's already stored in an ecosystem, if you can prevent its loss, so that does take demonstrating that there is a risk to that area, to that project area, and demonstrating what that risk be. For instance, we're looking at a project in Belize where there is an imminent development risk, and so we can look at the conversion rate in the nearby area and what we estimate that to be, and then that is how we would basically measure or account for that prevented carbon loss by protecting those intact wetlands. Hopefully that answers the question.
I can offer a little bit more to that. Here we were thinking about peatlands, of course, and trying to keep the carbon in the peatlands as a conservation measure. And our first approach was that these peatlands are mined. They're mined to get the gravel underneath them, and they're also mined for horticultural use. And that's a potential growing threat that we were concerned about. But we learned that that doesn't qualify, because if we prohibit mining or disturbing these peatlands here, people will just go elsewhere to get, for example, the horticultural peat. They'll go to Canada. So that didn't qualify. But what did qualify potentially is, like you were saying, Steph, the transfer of development. So if we can convince landowners like the borough or Native Alaskan corporations or others to not develop areas that are currently platted out for development, and we can show them that, hey, if you transfer those development rights to upland areas, then that would qualify. So just pretty much what you were saying, but just a little bit of clarification on what types of threats qualify.
That is a very important distinction. I'm glad you made it, because yes, especially in the voluntary carbon market, we do have this idea of leakage, which is basically what you were talking about. If activities can be moved elsewhere, then you have to account for that, and so you're probably not making gains in greenhouse gas reduction. So that's a very important distinction. Thank you. Anyone else wanted to add in for that question? No? All right, Lynn or Megan, next question.
Yeah, I got a good question here. Somebody asking about the scale and importance of pilot demonstration projects. So is there a minimum amount of carbon offset that makes, that seems to attract partners and that they're looking for market purposes?
That's a tricky question. Maybe we could have Tana and or Craig share some experience from those feasibility studies that you've been part of.
I would say that it's less about, and Tana and anyone else, correct me if I'm off base here, but it's more about making the project itself financially viable at that scale. It's less about making it of interest to an offset buyer. At least that's where we are now, because we haven't been able to find a project that is financially viable yet to offer any credits or any offset credits. So maybe that's my my orientation is just, not having been able to get there yet. So, Tana, do you have anything to add there?
Just a little bit. I think what Craig offered, we are also at the same place in that you'd have to. It's about making that project viable. That's why we do feasibility studies to see does this make sense? Is this investment going to be worth it? And you are looking at a number of different factors for whether a project would make sense. But there are what we call transaction costs involved in bringing a project to market. And so there's a cost there, a cost from both showing where the project will make gains, a cost to go through the whole methodology and apply it to your project. And so there's that, you could consider them kind of startup costs of bringing that project to market. And so looking at where the potential gains would be for carbon credits, you need to kind of offset that against what the cost will be to bring the project to market. And that's where the scale part comes in. So for like us in New England, where we have many smaller wetland types, many of them probably by themselves probably wouldn't be viable carbon market projects just because the project scale is not big enough to have that gain from the carbon market offset the cost of bringing the project to market. But we do have one project that we were looking at as part of our Bringing Wetlands to Market example, exploring a case study at the Herring River project on Cape Cod, where we're just going through that process of learning, doing that feasibility analysis and looking at all the other factors that must come together. And it's not just monetary ones that need to come together. You also have to look at who owns the land, you have to look at legal issues. There are a lot of different aspects involved in it, but since your question was about scale, it does come back to what Craig says, which is like, what's going to make that project viable and really looking at where it makes sense. And so for the Herring River project, which is just about 1,000 acres or so, that size it seems to make sense as a project size and projects bigger than that. Stephanie, maybe you could offer some more about actual acreage of wetlands and what you noticed.
Sure. I mean, and I think it really, the real answer here is it varies. It depends on what habitat you're in, what activities you're looking at. That's why we look at for these avoided conversion projects or these methane reduction projects, because you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck for a smaller area. I mean, 1,000 acres is an amazing size, but we realize that that's really big in a lot of the places that we work. So this idea that both Tana and Craig have mentioned about aggregating or grouping projects is an option in the voluntary carbon market, where you take smaller projects, you group them together, because basically the cost of project development on the carbon side of things is fairly streamlined. So the bigger a project gets, those project fees are pretty fixed. So it kind of brings down that cost a little bit. When we're developing our carbon projects right now that we're working on at TNC, we're really looking for philanthropic support up front to cover some of those projects, especially these pilot projects are really new and investors, are interested in supporting those type of new ideas. So, where there's grant fundings and other resources, I would definitely consider that and as a way to cover some of those upfront costs. But as far as coming down with an actual acreage number, it really depends. That's why those feasibility assessments are so important up front to really understand what the potential is. We'll go to another question. How about that? Lynn, what do you have for us?
Yeah, maybe just kind of continuing that same vein of questions. Someone who's asking about the current price that's being paid for blue carbon. Could you put any bounds on what's expected?
I'll say from the voluntary carbon market perspective right now, if you look at something like the State of the Voluntary Carbon Market, that's a report that's put out by Ecosystem, Marketplace, and Forest Trends every year. That the average price for land use projects usually falls around $3 to $5. With that said, projects that have co-benefits tend to go up higher for like $8 to $10, and those are forestry and other land use projects that have co-benefits. They're very charismatic. Purchasers want to buy them. And I mentioned before about at least the demand I see from people asking for blue carbon projects or blue carbon offsets. We know just from that the demand for these offsets is high, and the supply, at least initially and probably for a while, is going to be low. So that is a benefit for the project developer to be able to set those higher prices. I would also add that a lot of these corporations that are buying offsets they're usually looking for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of offsets to offset their emissions, their unavoidable emissions. And so generally speaking, they are looking for a portfolio of projects. They know that a blue carbon project per se or a forestry project is not going to offer all of those offsets. So they look for portfolios of projects. They might buy, 60% of their offsets from very cheap projects, and the rest from, they might be paying more premium prices for more charismatic projects that they can use in their outreach and promotion to their clientele. So that's where we're hoping to get those higher end project prices for carbon, say around $10 or so. This is all to say that this is all from the voluntary market perspective. The regulated market, things do go for higher prices. But as Craig mentioned before, the regulated market has not accepted wetlands as a project category quite yet. They really look for success in the voluntary carbon market first before they adopt those new project categories. So again, the importance of those pilot projects. And I realize I took a lot of that, so I'm gonna look across the panelists and see if anyone wants to add anything.
Sounded perfect to me, Stephanie.
There was just one clarifying question for you, Stephanie. So what are the units for that? So $10 for what exactly?
That's a metric ton is a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is one offset. We say carbon offset a lot, but we realize we're not measuring CO2, it's methane, nitrous oxide. Those are all converted to metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So that's how we're measuring this.
I have another question here about what Tana mentioned, her discussion about linking what you've all done and what you've all learned to policies. What experience does the panel have with states incorporating blue carbon into climate plans or greenhouse gas mitigation goals?
I think I might go to Tana first for this one. Maybe you could give us more details of what you've been involved in.
Yes. So in Massachusetts, as I mentioned, the Bringing Wetlands to Market project occurred in 2 phases. In the first phase, what we were really trying to do is build awareness about this ecosystem service and build people's understanding of where the entry points were for incorporating blue carbon into policy considerations. And so through that engagement with stakeholders working at the state level, where we got to was an understanding where there was language included in the climate action plan that Massachusetts developed at that time to recognize the value that wetlands play in this area. It wasn't very quantitative at that time in terms of around specific greenhouse gas reduction goals as it pertains to blue carbon gains, but having language included to say we need to look at the contribution of wetlands in this area, and that's important to take into account as part of our inventory. And that led to some other kind of tool development at the state level to explore that further. So I would say that was a first kind of win, both working with the stakeholders to think about the application points in policy was in and of itself a journey of learning, and then having that language incorporated. At the end of this second phase of Bringing Wetlands to Market, Massachusetts is going through another update to their greenhouse gas inventory, and they're looking at different places to incorporate policy, concrete policy considerations for wetlands. So we're actually in that process now, where we're talking about what are the policy considerations that can be put on the table, the pros and cons, what is actually actionable, where could we implement it, where can things be enforced, that kind of thing. So this whole idea of methane benefits, also looking at just wanting to see where we want to stop any kind of action to further degrade wetlands, and how you actually put that language into policies where we are right now, and we'll be bringing together other stakeholders, other scientists to work with our policymakers and work through that. So I find it to be a really exciting time because we've done the science, we've gotten some of that learning, and then that journey of bringing it into policy is right on it, is also emerging. And so in another year or so, we'll be hearing more about where Massachusetts took that conversation. And there'll be other states that are doing the very same thing and looking for those opportunities too. So I think it's rather exciting. myself, just to see it come from a thought to science, to advancing that and seeing it going along that pathway.
Great, thanks, Tana. That is very exciting. I hope you can keep us up to date on how that progresses as well. I don't know if the other panelists have anything they'd like to add for policy where you're working. Craig shaking his no, Kui? No. I'll mention one a couple that I'm aware of as far as things that have been brought to the floor on the Hill here in the DC area. One was a bill proposed sometime around last year, I believe, the Coastal Resilience Bill, and that was proposed by Senator Booker. It did include coastal wetlands along with forestry, grasslands, and other landscapes that sequester and store carbon. And then more recently, I believe it was Representative Bonamici, which is that's Oregon or Oregon right now. It was also looking to include coastal wetlands in some climate mitigation bills that were focusing on natural climate solutions. So we are seeing this come up at the national level, which I think is also super exciting right now as well. And we'll have to track, see how that goes. All this work is of course complementary to that and supporting that. Lynn, we'll go back and see if we've got some more questions.
Yeah, I got another question here about the blue carbon science. Wondering if you could compare the blue carbon potential of different habitat types, marshes, forested, wetlands, as well as seagrass habitats?
Sure, I think that as far as the blue carbon potential across these different ecosystems was the question. I think it really does depend on where you are. I think for one, mangroves tend to be a large carbon store because we see they have so much more biomass. But salt marsh in general, coastal wetlands, salt marsh, seagrass, and mangroves all are capturing and storing carbon in the soil at much greater rates than their terrestrial counterparts on a per area basis. I'd love to also tag a couple of our panelists here. So maybe Kui could talk about peatlands, and Craig, I might ask you to spend a little more on the study that looked at the forested tidal wetlands. Kui, are you okay with going first?
Yeah, sure. So we initially started our journey into blue carbon by looking at our salt marshes and thinking that those would be the places where blue carbon would be stored. And we found that for a number of reasons, our coastal salt marshes are not storing carbon very much at all here. But we also, as I mentioned earlier, we've been working in these vast peatlands where the headwaters of our streams are, and these peatlands are big. They can be meters and meters deep, 10 more, 20 meters deep. They're, represent thousands of hectares. I mean, they're big systems. And so we started thinking, what are peatlands? They're carbon. I mean, that's what it's just, stored organic material that hasn't decomposed because it's cold and wet up here. And so we started thinking these are not maybe where what people are thinking of when they think of blue carbon. So we kind of started calling them turquoise carbon because they're, connected to our salmon streams, which are, our connection with the ocean, and salmon are running, from ocean, of course, all the way up to the headwaters of these streams where the peatlands are supporting them. And so we started referring to them as turquoise carbon, but they are big. They speak to this idea of scale. We suspect they have a lot of volume. And so we have some small grants now to kind of move forward and really assess that volume so we can report out on, the different type. There's many different types of peatlands. We are trying to understand how the different types are storing carbon. So they're a little bit, I know there are peatland methodologies for assessing peatlands now internationally. And so it is recognized as one of the ways that carbon is stored. And we're, like I mentioned earlier, we're just on the verge of learning and bringing that to our community and to Alaska in general, because I think there's a lot of potential here in Alaska for understanding how these peatlands contribute to climate change, and of course that added bonus of wild Alaskan salmon.
Yes, great. It sounds like a lot of potential, and I love the turquoise carbon. Maybe we can get that done as well. Craig, you want to give us some more, maybe expand on what you were telling us before about the forested tidal wetlands and looking at storage across those systems?
Sure. I'm looking at one of our graphs here from our carbon stocks project, and the lower you are in the tidal frame, the lower the carbon storage potential appears to be in the Northwest. So starting with eelgrass, that's going to be the lowest carbon storage potential, and then stepping up to low marsh, low emergent marsh, to high marsh. And then, as Stephanie said, for us, the forested tidal wetlands, like mangroves, and I think that even exceeds mangroves on a per acre basis. Forested tidal wetlands are storing a great deal, and that's because they are both storing in carbon in soils and above ground biomass and all of the down wood in the marsh surface. So I think that was the question, and that that storage in the forested tidal wetlands is so great that those wetlands are actually low brackish or freshwater tidal wetlands, and so they do emit quite a bit of relatively quite a bit of methane, but they work as blue carbon projects out here because of the carbon storage is so great that it outstrips even that methane, those methane emissions.
Great, thanks, Craig. And I think there's a lot more information to unpack there from these different feasibility studies. So I think I really urge people to see what those resources are. I think a lot of them are available through the NERRS Science Collaborative website. We do have about 4 minutes left, so I want to go ahead and bring us home with one final question for our panelists. And I'll ask this, and we'll go in reverse order than we started. So we'll start with you, Kui. So my question is, what is the unique contribution of the NERRS system to advancing our work?
So I think none of the work that we're doing here in Alaska would happen without a reserve and without funding from the NERRS Science Collaborative, which gave us our first grant, which allowed us to explore this. And so we were able to partner through a science transfer grant with Quoit Bay, with Tana Marie, and Jim Rassman came out and helped us understand what they had learned about bringing wetlands to market, which really elevated our ability to communicate with our partners and helped us develop a plan for what we needed to do to move forward. We are the only ones in this region, and I think in all of Alaska that I know of, that are actually able to explore these concepts of blue and turquoise carbon. And that's largely because the reserves have so much flexibility to respond to community needs. And we know people are interested here. We know the landowners I mentioned are really interested, but we're actually able to respond to those needs through that flexibility. So I think for me, that the network of reserves and the flexibility that we have to work with each other and in our regions is really key.
So true, so true. Tana, we'll go to you next.
And I want to piggyback on this from what Chloe said. So what makes the reserve system such a great platform to do blue carbon work and other types of science like it is because we're a network of systems and we're set up, it's almost like the perfect place to do it because we're set up to function as natural laboratories to encourage and facilitate research and to have that support system. And then in addition to that, we have an entity like the Science Collaborative that's focused on supporting science, investing in science that's being done to serve the community needs and questions at reserves. And so that's what happened over this journey with blue carbon up to this point. And all of us here on the panel have had some connections with reserves where this work has taken place. So I think that's a testament to what we're saying in terms of the opportunity to work at reserves. But in addition to just places where the science is happening, I'd also point out that all of these projects have been developed to be collaborative projects. We are really looking at a different paradigm of not just having the science innovation take place and be published in peer-reviewed articles, but also taking that body of learning and connecting it with people who can apply it to policy, to restoration decisions, to management areas, and so many different ways. We have educators here at the Reserve that have developed a curriculum that's being applied in high school classrooms right now around the topic of blue carbon. And so not just places for the research to happen, but places where we can, because we're connected by a network of systems and we're connected in our communities, to work with a diverse group of stakeholders to bring this and advance the learning and that application point. So I think the Reserve system is just perfectly poised to support this work and to support continued collaboration, which is necessary to make the gains that we want to see in the various realms of using blue carbon. So I can't say enough about how ready the Reserve system has been and the contributions that it's made to blue carbon, and how poised we are to even work with partners, which is a huge part of our work ethic, to take that learning further.
Very well said. Very well said. Thank you, Tana. Craig, less than a minute.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what everybody else said. The NERRS making this blue carbon a priority is huge, and the NERRS Science Collaborative again. And I just want to make sure that we're talking NERRS staff here. I'm an outsider now, so I benefit from everything that the NERRS staff offers, everything from helping develop project concepts to invaluable logistical assistance, and that includes definitely the coastal training program, access to local end user networks that ensures the relevance of our work to end users. So it's, the NERRS are really well set up to be doing this work, and it's very much appreciated.
Completely agreed. That collaborative nature, flexibility to respond to community needs, that networking, all of the above. It's a great benefit and service that this system provides. So with that, I know we're about a minute over. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who participates. And I'll hand it back to Nick for any last minute words.
Thanks, Steph. Just a few announcements as we wrap up. In the coming weeks, we'll have produced a written document, which we call a management brief, which features the work of the projects mentioned during today's webinar and other projects that in the reserves and working on blue carbon in the reserve system. The brief will also include a full Q&A record incorporating responses to any questions we didn't have time to answer. So if you are still on the line and you still have a question or your question didn't get answered, I'll leave the session open for a few minutes after, and you can go ahead and enter any questions in that you still want to ask, and we'll incorporate them into the final record. The session recording from today's webinar will be available within a few days and posted to the Science Collaborative's YouTube channel, so keep an eye out for that. And as you leave the webinar, you'll also be directed to a brief exit survey. We welcome your ideas about next steps and potential synergies around this topic. So if you have any ideas you'd like to share that you'd like included, please go ahead and enter those into the exit survey if you've already signed out. And finally, one final announcement. Next month's webinar will be April 21st. That is going to be on restoring native oysters on North America's West Coast with Kirsten Wasson and April Ridland. And we'll be sending out some event reminders in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for those. And with that, we'll end with a big thank you to all of our participants and to our panelists and to our moderator, Stephanie. Thank you all for the great work.